Good morning, everyone. Just my apologies. First of all, I my camera is not working this morning, so I'll just do this intro without camera, if that's okay. So, just to say that you are all very welcome to this morning's webinar on the changes to the Residential Tenancies Act. My name is Marion O'Reilly, and I work in the Communications and Development team in the PSRA. I'm joined then by Emer Morrissey and Gary Byrne from the Compliance and Enforcement team in the RTB. And we are also joined by Sinead Murphy from the RTB Communications team. We have had a huge number of people register to attend this webinar, so we have in fact been oversubscribed, and I think that really reflects the importance of this piece of legislation to the property services sector. Approximately 80% of PSRA licensees are registered to provide letting services, so it is very important to be fully informed, and it's great to see the level of interest that we have had in this event. And this session is being recorded and it will be made available on the PSRA website for any of your colleagues who may not have been able to register on time. And we are hoping to, in fact, run another session in a few weeks' time. So there may be an opportunity for people who missed out this time to attend that. I will shortly hand you over to our colleagues in the RTB to present on the new regulations, but just to note that there will be a Q&A session after the presentation, and thanks to everyone who submitted questions in the last few days. Again, we've had a very large number of questions, and I think that most of them will be addressed through the presentation, but we will try to get to as many of the other questions as time allows when the presentation is over. So I will hand you over now to Emer and Gary.
Over to you, Gary.
Brilliant. Oh yeah, thanks, Emer. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for attending the session. So, as Marion mentioned, my name is Gary Byrne and I work in our Compliance and Enforcement team in the RTB. So I'm going to start off by giving an overview of the changes to legislation that commenced on the 1st of March. Hopefully my audio is okay, by the way. If anyone can't hear me, just shout, or someone just message me or let me know. So I'm going to take us through a high-level overview, and then I'm going to look at, in a bit more detail, ending a tenancy and how the changes have affected that process. I'll then pass you over to my colleague Emer, and she'll begin to look at the rent side of things, changes to setting and reviewing rent and what's different there. And then at the end of the presentation, Emer will have a couple of scenarios or examples as well to hopefully bring things to life. And then I think I'll take us through a couple of demos and a couple of practical tools that we now have available on the RTB website that will be useful. And then hopefully all in that will give people a good understanding of the changes before we move into any remaining questions that people may have. So just to, again, at a high level, what has changed or what is changing from the 1st of March this year? The legislation collectively, in general terms, can be seen to have introduced stronger tenancy protections. The rules have changed in terms of how and when a landlord can end a tenancy. And the system of rent regulation that was in place, the rent pressure zones, has been replaced by a new system of what's been referred to as national rent control. And sorry for labouring the point, and I know people will be aware, but just to really stress, these changes have taken effect from the 1st of March and they apply to new tenancies that have been created from that date going forward. And these changes do not apply for pre-existing tenancies that were in place prior to the 1st of March. So again, just as a general point and to make the people aware, I'm sure you're familiar that there's this concept of security of tenure within a tenancy. So this is a tenant's right to stay in the rented home. The principle of this hasn't changed and it's always been present within the legislation. So it's the idea that after 6 months of continuous occupation in the dwelling, a tenant will gain some additional rights to remain in that dwelling. That assumes that during that initial 6 months, the landlord hasn't served a valid notice of termination within that time. And then as you move beyond that 6 months, these additional rights and protections will kick in. tenancies that have been created from the 1st of March onwards are deemed to be what's known now as tenancies of minimum duration. And these tenancies of minimum duration refer to a 6-year period. It's not absolute in nature. I'll come on to now. There are some scenarios where a tenancy could potentially be ended, but this idea of a tenancy of minimum duration lasting 6 years is now in the legislation from the 1st of March of this year. So just in terms of ending a tenancy and serving a notice of termination, when can that happen? Why could that happen? I'll just move on to the next slide. So again, referring back to that earlier slide about this initial 6 months within a tenancy, landlords, regardless of if they're deemed to be a small or a large landlord, and I will come on to that shortly, but landlords can end a tenancy in the first 6 months of a new tenancy without recourse or reference to any of the other grounds for termination. These are the grounds people will be familiar with, these long-standing grounds around things like sale and renovation, etc. The caveat here, and I suppose the piece of general information that we're kind of reminding people of, is just in reference to any fixed term rental agreements or lease agreements that happen to be in place. And I'll just have a couple of words here on lease agreements in general. So the law hasn't changed in this respect, and there's nothing new here. This has always been the case and remains the case, that a written lease or tenancy agreement is optional. There's no legal requirement to have one when a tenancy commences or during a tenancy, but they are, as people will be familiar, quite common in the sector. And if you enter into a lease agreement, the term of that lease agreement is not stipulated in legislation anywhere. So in other words, you can have what's known as a periodic tenancy agreement. There's no specified end date, or it could be for a fixed period. For example, 6 months, 12 months, 1 year, 2 years, etc. So none of that is defined in legislation. But just to be clear, a tenancy agreement or a lease agreement cannot contract outside of legislation. You cannot contract away rights and obligations. The legislation provides a floor on protections, rights and obligations, and then the lease agreement, such as it is, will sit on top of that. If a lease is for a fixed period of time, you need to obviously be conscious of any term within that lease in reference to a break clause or an option to end that fixed term early. So the general principle is, I'm sure people will be familiar, if a lease agreement is for a fixed period of time and there is no break clause written into that lease agreement, in general, the only reason that term can be ended early is if there's a breach of obligations by one of the parties. So again, none of that's new information, or that hasn't changed, or the law hasn't changed anything in that respect, but we're just going to say that at a high level by way of a kind of a caveat to this information. So after 6 months of continuous occupation, a landlord can end a tenancy, but it's only on specified legal grounds. Again, that general idea is it has been present and remains present in the legislation, but ending a tenancy from that point forward will depend on when the tenancy began. Is it pre or post the 1st of March? And whether the landlord is deemed to be a small or a large landlord for the purposes of the legislation. Emer's going to touch on the rent side of things a little bit more shortly, but just one thing to flag up front. If a landlord has availed of this opportunity to end a tenancy early in the first 6 months and they've ended the tenancy correctly, they will not then be entitled to reset the rent to market for that subsequent tenancy. So again, Emer will come on to this, but just to stress, the concept of resetting rent to market for new tenancies after the 1st of March is linked directly to how the previous tenancy ended. There's a direct link there. And if you avail of this option to terminate in the first 6 months, you are not entitled to then reset to market for the subsequent tenancy. But again, we'll clarify that a little bit further later on. So ending a tenancy that's been created from the 1st of March, these new tenancies that have commenced after the law has changed, regardless of the landlord's size, so whether a landlord is a small or a large landlord, a landlord can end a tenancy if a tenant has breached their tenancy obligations. So that's always been the case, and that remains the case, and that's a universal principle, whether there's an agreement or no agreement, that remains the case. Landlords, again, regardless of their designation, be they small or large, can also end a tenancy if the dwelling is deemed to be no longer suitable to the accommodation needs of the tenant. So that's with reference to the number of bed spaces in the dwelling and the composition and number of people occupying the household. So again, it's that specific piece. It's not a general suitability issue. It's the dwelling no longer suitable to the accommodation needs. After the 1st of March, a landlord can potentially end a tenancy for other grounds, but only if they're deemed to be a small landlord. I'll come on to that now. If a landlord has between 1 and 3 tenancies at the point of service of a notice of termination, so again, to stress that, this designation of small and large, it's only relevant at the time you're serving a notice of termination. This designation could potentially change during the lifetime of a tenancy, etc. But the key date, the key reference point is here at the point you're serving that notice of termination. If you have between 1 or 3 tenancies, you're deemed to be a small landlord for the purposes of legislation. If you have 4 tenancies plus, or you're a company, you're deemed to be a large landlord. And again, for clarity, if you're a company landlord, regardless of the number of tenancies you have, you're designated as a large landlord for the purposes of the legislation. So small landlords can end a tenancy during the 6-year tenancy cycle, this tenancy of minimum duration, to sell the dwelling. That's an existing ground, but it's now anchored to the idea that there needs to be an undue financial or other hardship present to sell during the 6-year minimum term. The law is quite specific on what constitutes financial or other hardship, and it lays out some criteria. It's things around discharging a debt, bankruptcy, working with a PIP, needing the proceeds to purchase your own property, etc. There's quite specific grounds. The other ground that a landlord could potentially end, a small landlord could end a tenancy during the 6-year term is if they or a close family member needs to live in that property. At the end of the 6-year cycle, as it were, the other grounds for termination open back up for small landlords. These are the ones people will be familiar with. The landlord or family member needs to live in the property. The landlord needs to sell the property, but that's without any recourse or reference to financial hardship, to substantially refurbish or renovate, or to change the use of the property. And all of those grounds for termination, as was the case, remains the case, can carry with them some other requirements and obligations around the provision of a statement or a statutory obligation. And I'll show you some of our templates a little bit later as well. In terms of large landlords, they're more restricted in terms of how they can end a tenancy, and they're restricted to the 2 reasons I mentioned earlier. A large landlord can only end a tenancy if a tenant has breached their obligations, or if the dwelling is no longer suitable to the accommodation needs of the tenant. And that's the case during the 6-year minimum term and at the end of the minimum term. Of course, the tenant could potentially end the tenancy, but from the landlord side, their large landlords are restricted to those 2 grounds for termination. Again, all of that was, just to stress, was with reference to new tenancies after the 1st of March, looking backwards. So pre-existing tenancies are under what we just generally refer to as the old rules that people will be familiar with. The grounds for termination exist for those landlords to end tenancies that are pre-1st of March. There's no difference based on how the landlord is designated or categorized in terms of being small or large. It's simply the landlord can potentially end a tenancy, bearing in mind, as I said earlier, any fixed term without a break clause, but those grounds for termination exist. As they had exist, they continue to exist for those pre-1st of March tenancies. And one additional scenario, it's not too common and I won't dwell on it, but for tenancies that are in place for quite a while, these pre-June 2022 tenancies, the law changed in June 2022 and introduced this concept of tenancies of unlimited duration. Before that, people may remember we had these Part 4 cycles that ran in 4 years and then 6 years. And as you came towards the end of your Part 4 cycle, you could end a tenancy without needing any other reason or any other ground for termination. So for those pre-June 2022 tenancies, they're still entitled to end a tenancy as they come to the end of their Part 4 or further Part 4 cycle without reference to any other ground for termination. These tenancies are becoming lesser and lesser, and by June 2028, they'll be completely washed out of the system as such, or the market, as all these tenancies will have either ended or they'll transition to these tenancies of unlimited duration. But that's just a flag for those older tenancies. This one other ground for termination is a potential. And one other point before I hand you over to Emer, who'll look at the rent side of things, is just on service of notices, and this will probably be very relevant to yourselves in terms of how you do your work. I'm sure it'll be a welcome option, is that the law now provides for the provision, or sorry, the service of documents or notices to be carried out electronically. So Section 6 of the Act, which deals with service, has been amended, and there's now an additional option. The law states that notices or documents can be served by email, fax is in there for some reason, or other electronic contact point. The system needs to be capable of producing a record that the notice or the document has been sent. So not necessarily received, but sent. And I suppose what we're encouraging and advising people here is to take a precautionary approach, particularly for ongoing and existing tenancies. While it's there, it's legally permissible if a landlord and a tenant has had no email contact whatsoever up to this point, and all of a sudden a very important document is served by email. It could potentially cause confusion, or it can lead to a dispute or someone challenging something. So what we're kind of advising in general terms is to have good, clear communication. If contact details change, all parties should let the other side know, and to build into tenancy agreements from the start of a new tenancy what the method of service will be, and that each side is clear and is agreed on how documents will be served. If there's any doubt, or if there's any kind of sense of people wanting to be extra cautious, the traditional methods of service remain. You can post or hard copy deliver documents as well. And one other point to stress, because it has come up on other sessions, is that this is a new method of deliveries, but the notices of termination themselves are prescribed documents. So the templates are on our website and need to be used, but you would be attaching the notice to an email, for example. You wouldn't be typing the notice into the body of an email. So it's the electronic method, or the email is now the delivery channel, and the notice would be attached to that. Hopefully that's a bit of an overview, and I'll pass you back to Emer for the moment, and I'll come back later to do some demos. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Gary. I'm just going to keep my camera off for this section, just because I've been having some difficulties with network, so hopefully everybody can hear me okay. So I'm just going to bring you through the rent setting and rent reviews, because some things have changed in new legislation in relation to that. And then I have a couple of scenarios at the end, just to give a practical example of rent setting and rent reviews and how they work. So just to start off, I'm just going to talk about the national rent controls. So the system of national rent control, this came in from the 1st of March, and this replaces the rent pressure zones across all of Ireland. So back in June 2025, the whole of Ireland basically came under a rent pressure zone, which meant that when you're doing rent reviews or setting rent where there had been an existing tenancy, the amount that you could increase the rent by was capped by 2%, or the rate of inflation. So this basically, the national system of rent control is just a slight change in that, but it's very similar to rent pressure zones. So it still requires the use of the rent calculator, which is on our website, and it's still capped by 2%. So like I said, the rules apply to rent reviews and to rent setting at the start of a tenancy, where a tenancy was ended in a no-fault eviction. So the rent control rules, they come in from the 1st of March. They cover all private rented tenancies and student-specific accommodation. So again, like I said, that's not much of a change to the previous rent pressure zone rules. The only difference is that rent can be increased once per year by 2%, which is the same, but the rate of inflation is a little bit different. So it's now done off the Consumer Price Index, where it used to be by HISAP. And then another thing the new legislation brings in is this resetting to market rent. So this is a new thing where at certain points of the tenancy, or for certain conditions, the rent can be reset to market rent. So it applies in a private rented tenancy created from the 1st of March 2026. It's only allowed where a new tenancy begins, but only if the last tenancy ended because the tenant left by choice, they breached their obligations, or if the property is no longer suitable for their needs. And it's allowed at the end of a 6-year cycle or tenancy of minimum duration for those tenancies that started from the 1st of March. But for existing tenancies that were created before the 1st of March, resetting to market rent is not allowed. So rent reviews fall into the national rent controls, and rent settings should be kept within the national rent controls. So there are some exceptions to this. So different rules apply in different cases. So one of them is for new apartments and new student-specific accommodation. This is only where the construction commenced from the 10th of June 2025. And for those properties that were newly built where the construction commenced after the June 10th, the annual increase can follow the CPI. So there's no 2% cap. But obviously if the CPI is below 2%, it's set at that. But if it's above 2%, there's no cap on it and they can be increased. For resetting to market rent for those SSA, so SSA tenancies, that's all SSA tenancies, they're allowed to reset to market rent every 3 years from the 1st of March. So that's obviously in private rented properties, that's every 6 years. So slight difference for SSAs. And approved housing bodies and cost rental tenancies, the national rent control rules don't apply to them. So this is just a summary table explaining all those differences and when the annual increases can happen and how they're capped, and then when resetting to market rent is allowed. So this is up on our website, and we have a number of really helpful leaflets and videos on the website just to kind of explain the resetting to market rent and the national rent controls. And this is just a summary table of that. So it just explains the difference between a private tenancy that started before the 1st of March, ones that started after the 1st of March, those new apartments and new SSAs that commenced after the 10th of June, and just the rule for student-specific accommodation in general. So rent setting and rent review guide. I'm just going to bring you through the different steps now in relation to rent setting and then rent reviewing. So rent setting occurs at the start of a tenancy. So this is where you've got a new tenancy beginning and you are setting the rent for the tenant at the commencement of the tenancy. So when you're setting rent in a new tenancy, there's 5 kind of key steps to follow to do this. So firstly is to check that rent control rule that applies to the rent setting. So that's going back to that summary table and seeing, well, which rule applies to me here, and then making sure that you're applying the correct one. So if applicable, so if it was previously rented, then you're using the rent calculator to calculate the maximum rent permitted. In relation to rent setting, you always have to use the rent register to find the 3 comparable rents, and we'll be giving a demo of that later on. Then you can download the rent review notice from the RTB website. And as Gary said, you need to use the rent setting notice that's on our website. And you send this to the tenant and the RTB on the same day. And for rent setting, this is at the commencement of the tenancy. So it's at the beginning of the tenancy that you're sending the rent setting notice to the RTB and to the tenant. And then as well, it's important to remember that you need to register any new tenancy within 1 month of commencement. So checking the rent control rules. So this is what we went through previously. So I suppose it's about whether you fall into setting the rent within the national rent control rules, or whether you're able to reset to market rent. So the rule is that if the property was previously rented in the past 2 years and the tenancy ended through a no-fault termination, then the rent is controlled under the national rent control rules. So this means that the new rent has to be set in line with the CPI and capped at 2%. So you're setting this new rent off the previous rent in the tenancy. But if you're going to be able to set to market rent, this is for cases where the property is brand new to the market, so it's never been rented before, or it hasn't been rented for the past 2 years, or if the last tenancy was ended because the tenant left by choice, they either breached their obligations, or if the property no longer suited their needs. And it's really important, if you're setting to market rent, to go and check the exemptions to rent setting to make sure to see if you actually fit one of those exemptions. And on the rent setting form that you have to fill in, you'll have to tick one of those exemptions to mark whichever one applies to you. So if you fall under that rule, then you can set to market rent. So just those cases where there was a previous tenancy. So in these cases, you're using the rent calculator to calculate the correct rent. So like I said, you have to fall into that category where if there was a previous tenancy in the past 2 years and the tenancy ended through no fault termination, then you're capped at those national rent control rules. So this means it can only be increased by 2% or the rate of inflation. And to do this rent setting, you're using that rent calculator to check the rent amount. So the rent calculator, it replaces the RPZ calculator, but it's exactly the same in what information you have to put in, the last rent amount, when the last rent was set, and when you're setting the new rent, and then it will give you the amount of increase allowed. And then you do a printout of that calculation and include it in the rent setting form. You also need to use a rent register when you're doing your rent setting for where there was a previous tenancy. So you have to just use the rent register and then get your 3 comparables and include them on the rent setting form. So we'll go through a demo of the rent register later. But I suppose with this, a landlord must use the information from the rent register to confirm that the rent setting is not above market rent. So you're using your rent calculator to see the amount you're permitted to use, but you also have to use the rent register to show that that rent amount is not above market rent. So you have to provide 3 examples from the rent register of the most recent rents paid in similar properties in a comparable area. And the rent register will give you the results that most closely match your tenancy. You select any 3 comparables from the example. So the rent register gives you 10 comparable properties, but you only have to pick 3 from that. It doesn't have to be the first 3 on it. It can be any 3 from that 10 that you feel is the most similar to your tenancy. And then on that, you fill the information in on the rent setting form of the amounts and the RT numbers for those tenancies. And then you download a printout of the rent register results, which you can do straight from the website, and you include that with your rent setting form. And where there was no previous tenancy, so this is where you're allowed to reset to market rent. So the resetting of market rent is allowed for new tenancies commencing from the 1st of March, where no tenancy had existed in the past 2 years, or where the last tenancy was ended by the tenant, or where the landlord ended the tenancy because of breach of obligations, or the property was no longer suited to the accommodation needs of the tenant. So again, if you think that you're eligible to set it to market rent, do check the exemptions on the website. When you're filling in the form, tick one of the exemptions. So in these cases, you're just looking at the rent register to make sure that the rent set is not above market rent. So you must give a tenant the statement of the new rent to show that it's not above market rent. And this has to include the details of the rent paid for the 3 comparable properties and the RT numbers. And there's a place on the rent setting form, again, like I said, where you fill this out. And the rent setting form has to be completed and sent to the tenant and the RTB at the commencement of the tenancy. And it's really important that you do this. And we'll show you how to do this on our new service centre. So that's rent setting, which is at the start of a tenancy, and this is for reviewing the rent. So that's where you're doing your rent reviews within the tenancy. So rent reviews can be done on an annual basis. They don't have to be, and not everybody updates their rent on an annual basis. But whether you do it annually or you do it every 2 years, the rent calculator calculates the amount that you're allowed to increase it by. So like I said, the rent review rules. Rent can only be reviewed every 12 months. The annual rent reviews must be in line with the national rent control rules. This means they can only be increased by a maximum of 2% or by inflation, whichever is the lower. The rate of inflation is measured now by the Consumer Price Index, so that's a slight difference to previously when it was under the HISEP. And for tenancies that started after the 1st of March, rent can be reset after 6 years. So that will be 2032 will be the earliest ones that they can be reset. So again, this is only just for tenancies after the 1st of March. So if tenancies started today on the 10th of March, you can do your first annual rent review on the 1st of March 2027, and then keep doing them annually if you want to for that. And then you can reset to market rent in 2032 after the 6-year period if it's the same tenancy. So rent reviews and ongoing tenancies. So like I said before, you're using your rent register to find your 3 comparable rents. You download the rent setting form, that should be rent review. So you download the rent review form off the RTB website. You complete it fully and accurately and send it to the tenants and the RTB. You ensure the notice is served at least 90 days before the new rent takes effect, and then you update the rent amount for the tenancy on the tenancy registration. So just to say, for the rent reviews, you're using your rent calculator as well, and we'll give you a demo of that just after this. So I just want to walk you through two scenarios just of rent setting and rent reviews. So example one, so this is in a private tenancy. So in October 2025, a tenant served notice and they move out as they've bought their own property. So the former tenancy ends in February 2026, so just before the new legislation came in. The landlord then wants to rent the property out again, and a new tenancy commences in March 2026. So because the tenants left at their own volition, the landlord can set the rent to market rents. So to do this, the landlord uses the rent register to find the three comparables to show that they're not setting the rent above the market rent. And then when the property is rented out, they have to complete the rent setting form, including the RT numbers and the rent amounts from the three comparables, and include a printout of the rent register comparables. And on this form, they must confirm that the applicable exemption. So in this case, the exemption is because the previous tenancy ended by the tenant. The landlord then serves the rent setting form to the tenant at the start of the tenancy and uploads it to the RTB on the same day. And in relation to this, the completed form, like Gary said, it can be emailed to the tenant and then you can upload it to the RTB through the RTB Service Centre. So example two, in this case, in November 2025, the landlord served a notice of termination as they were planning on selling the property, but the sale of the property fell through after the tenants had left. So as the legislation states, the landlord had to offer the tenant the property back to the previous tenants. However, these tenants were settled somewhere else and they declined. So the landlord is now ready to relet the property in March 2026 because he's no longer selling it and he's already offered it back to the tenants. But as the property ended because of sale, the landlord cannot reset to market rent. So they have to reset the rent in line with the national rent controls. So to do this, the landlord uses the rent calculator to calculate the permitted rent increase and uses the rent register to find three comparables to show that they're not setting rent above market rent. The landlord can carry out then his annual rent reviews from 2027, and they can reset to market rent in 2032 if the same tenancy is in place. And the above would also apply if the property was sold and the new owner wished to rent a new tenancy. So if there's a new owner in the property, they would have to have the information on the previous rent in the tenancy and when that tenancy ended, and they can use that information then to set the rent by using the rent calculator. But if a tenancy is sold, if a property is sold and there was previously a tenancy in it, the landlord can't just reset to market rent. They have to set it off the previous tenancy. So I'm just going to finish that there and I'll hand back to Gary. I think he's going to do a few demos.
Thanks, Emer. Cheers. Hopefully people can hear me. So the last element will be we will just try and talk people through some the more practical tools that you'll be using. So just bear with me for 1 second. So hopefully that's popping up now and people can see a page on the RTB website.
Yeah, see that.
So just to talk through people through one or two of the resources. I won't dwell on this too long because I know you'll probably want to get to the practical rent tools, but there is an awful lot of information that's been updated on our website now. So just flagging on the ending the tenancy side of things, there is a suite of templates that I mentioned. So we've designed the template notices of termination in a way that they're scenario based and there's multiple documents under each scenario. In each example, there's a guidance note available to review and to read, which will just outline when and how this particular type of notice can be used. There's the notice of termination itself, which is a Word document and can be obviously made fit for purpose. There are the accompanying documents as well available. So if that particular reason carries with it a statutory declaration, that's available. You'll notice multiple documents and you'll be selecting the one that is relevant for your situation. So we've tried to cater for as many scenarios as possible. And that's why it may appear that there's, a huge number of documents under one particular scenario, but not all of these will be applicable. At a minimum, you'll have your notice of termination template, and then you'll also use whatever is the other relevant document, whether it's a statutory declaration. And again, whether it's pre or post the 1st of March, you'll this information here is applicable, and so it'll be useful to review this when you get a chance. I'm sure you're familiar with using these kind of templates already, but they have all been updated. And on the rent side of things, they're again in the resource section of our website. This page has been updated, and two key documents that are available now that Emer referenced is this notice of rent setting. This is a new form we've designed. So at the commencement of a new tenancy, this is a form that would be completed, and this is the form that will be given to the tenant and then copied to the RTB. And you may have already seen it, but I'll just scroll through very quickly. There's a checklist reminder at the top, and you're capturing some key details along the way. This form also will capture whether an exemption is applicable. So Part D of this form, people may have remembered we did have a standalone rent exemption, what was an RPZ exemption form. These forms can capture exemptions as well. So again, we've tried to minimize duplication and just lessen kind of admin burden, but you would capture here if the rent is being set outside of the normal rules and why that's the case. So that can be completed there. These forms, again, will be uploaded to the RTB Service Centre. If for some reason you can't access that, they can be posted in, but as I'll show you in a moment, we're encouraging people to use our service centre. It's a faster service, and you'll get these immediate email notifications. There's a notice of rent review as well up there. It's very similar layout. I won't go through all of it, but just to say that is for reviewing rent within a tenancy. And again, that can capture exemptions if applicable and if need be. So those two forms, a notice of rent setting at the commencement of a new tenancy, and notice of rent review within a tenancy, they're both up on our website now as well. Then just moving across to the rent register and the rent calculator. I'll show you these quickly now. So just on the rent calculator first, and this I won't dwell on this too long because people will be familiar with it. It's similar principle to calculators we've had on our website going back over years. This is used, obviously the first thing to establish is that you're not resetting rent to market and it's applicable, and when you're using it, you're inputting the relevant data. It's all very intuitive. One opening question is if the tenancy is inside an apartment or student-specific accommodation where the building commenced from the 10th of June last year, and that's because of that slight variation on whether the CPI is prevalent or whether it's capped out at 2%. In most scenarios, that won't be relevant. So just as a basic example, let's say it's a pre-existing dwelling that's already in place prior to last June, and just input sample rent, date the last rent was set, and then you pick the date you're setting the rent going forward, and once you submit it, it pops out results below, and this result can be printed and saved, etc., and it will let you know whether it's applying the CPI cap. It will automatically figure out whether what's applicable is it 2% pro rata or is it CPI. In this case, it's applied the 2% cap. So we'll apply the lower of the two, in this case, pro rata over 14 months. So people will be familiar with that, I'm sure, but it's just to flag it and let you know the calculator has been updated and it's available now. And then on the rent register side of things, which is, I know, where most queries lie, and it is a brand new tool, so everyone's kind of getting used to it. The rent register, before I do a demo, what I'll just quickly show you is there is a huge amount of accompanying information on the page. So it talks about how to use the register and what are the key pieces of that you need to input. And it's anchored around air code, the dwelling type, the number of bedrooms, the floor area in square meters, and the building energy rating. And just to state the obvious, that this rent register is returning to you information from registered tenancy. So in other words, information that has been provided to us by landlords and agents who have registered tenancies. It's not data we've kind of created as such. It's returning the data that's on our register. And as you scroll down to the bottom, and I'll run a couple of examples in a moment, but just to say how our register selects the results. And I know there's a lot of questions around this, so we've tried to expand on this to just outline how the register is operating. It's matched by air code to local electoral area. It returns air results from that local electoral area, and it returns up to 10 results. There's a matching score available, and the register will return properties that are an exact match first, and it matches in different ways on dwelling type and number of bedrooms, etc. Where there are less than 10 exact matches, it will start to return weaker matches, and the website outlines how the register does that. And they're date ordered within category. So where it's an exact match, the first return that will be visible will be by tenancy start date. As Emer mentioned, the returns here, you're not obliged to select any particular of the return, and the law does oblige landlords when setting rent to have regard to the register. So it may be that there's other factors that are relevant and that people want to highlight. But this is the primary source of information, and if you're bringing in anything from outside, or you feel, look, none of these returns are relevant, it's not expressly prohibited, but you do need to have strong evidence and documents to verify that and to kind of cover you in the event a tenant was to ever dispute the validity of rent setting or rent review, for example. Just to run, so people would be familiar with this kind of lookup technology. Once you start inputting an address, etc., it will spit out a return. And as you continue below, some information will be pre-populated by local authority and local electoral area. You'll select the dwelling type, the building energy rating, and the number of bedrooms, and then the floor space by square meters. And when you click search, it will call the API, and then there's returns populated below. So obviously no addresses are displayed, but RT numbers are displayed. They're your registered tenancy numbers, and they're what gets populated into your rent setting or rent review forms. There's a match score over here on the right to say how closely this is a match to that particular entry you've created above. And this as well can be printed and saved as a PDF, as you notice here. People will obviously have specific queries and questions, but we can go through them if need be. But just to say at a high level, that's the rent register, and I'd encourage people to use it, but to review the information at the bottom of the register as well, just to see how it's compiled. And the last thing I'll quickly show you before we move to any questions is just this service center. So people may be familiar with this if anyone has lodged a dispute through our dispute service within the last few months. It's the same platform and technology. This service center is now how we're receiving notices of termination, and notices of rent review, and notices of rent setting. So if you have an account, you log in or create an account, and this will be the homepage you'll see. Once you click on submit a notice, it will bring you through to the next page where it gives you 3 tiles, and really you're just selecting the relevant notice. Let's see if I can do a quick example here. Let's assume, for example, you're submitting a notice of termination, which will be served on the tenant and on the RTB on the same day. And it'll bring you then through to the next page. There'll be some information pre-populated based on your account, and then some drop-down questions to answer. We'll select the tenancy type, the date the tenancy began, what category the landlord falls into. You'll select the reason for tenancy termination. So this submission here has replaced what people may remember of a paper or a PDF notice of rent return form. This is the form. If you're submitting it online, date the tenancy will end. And then again, the address will be populated below. This is a test site, so I'll just put some data in for now. And when you have all the data entered, you're clicking below some tick box confirmation, confirming that the information above matches what's actually in the attached notice. You're uploading any supporting documents. The notice you're uploading is the same as the one given to the tenant, and that if you don't upload the correct documents, it may make the notice invalid. It's a drag and drop option, or you'll choose a file, and something here we can quickly add in. You have the option to save as a draft if need be, and then once you submit it, it will save to your records. It'll generate an auto email for confirmation to whoever submitted it. If you as an agent are submitting it, it will generate it back to you. And then also there will be slightly more formal letters issued out with some information by post as well. You can view your own records then at any stage when you log back in, and you can see notices that have been submitted. There are samples previously, you can see all of them, or just certain types of notices, and they can be called up again or reviewed if you need to print out another copy for your own records. So we would encourage people to use this service centre if at all possible. It is faster and it's a more efficient service. I may stop there for the moment, and hopefully that's a good overview for people. And I'll see if the others want to chip in as well, and if there's any questions or comments.
Thank you, Gary, and to you, Emer, as well. There have been quite a lot of questions have been flying in from the chat box there, but we won't obviously have time to get through them all. But there are, I suppose, similar themes running through the questions, and there's some repetition and some recurrent questions. So I'll pick out a fefew that I think might be pertinent to answer. And I know some of this will have been covered in the presentation, but just, I suppose, some things that people might want clarified. So one of the questions I have here is, if a landlord submits a notice of termination for a tenancy created before the 1st of March 2026 with a view to selling the property, and an investor buys it, so the property is bought by an investor, can the investor rent the apartment at market rate, or do they have to rent it based on the previous owners and tenants rate?
Yeah, I think you covered that one, Emer, didn't you? You clarified that. I think it's...
Yeah, that was in one of the scenarios. So I suppose it's something that's really important to remember, because we do see it sometimes in compliance, that if somebody buys a property that was previously rented out, it's really important that you get the information on the rent from the previous tenancy. So that's the rent amount and when it was set or reviewed last time, because the rent should be set off the previous tenancy. Obviously, it depends how that tenancy ended, but if the tenancy was ended for the purpose of sale and it started before the 1st of March, then they wouldn't be able to reset to market rent. So they will have to use that information to use the rent calculator to calculate the amount of rent that they're allowed to charge for that tenancy.
Okay, and just a question here that I think is coming up a few times. Under the new legislation, if a tenant leaves of their own accord, can the rent be put up to market value within 6 years? So if the tenant leaves after 2 years, for example, and the market rent hasn't increased, can the landlord go to the market rent and commence another 6-year cycle?
Yeah, that's correct. They can. If the tenant has ended the tenancy, the landlord is entitled to reset to market. And one kind of bit of general information on that is that a tenant is also obliged to serve a valid written notice of termination. And I mean, that's always been the case, but it places a particular kind of focus on it now, because I know in practice sometimes maybe there's less attention placed on that side of things, or perhaps landlords are often willing to just accept some kind of verbal notice, etc. But it is important to be clear on who's ending the tenancy. If it's the tenant that's ending the tenancy, I mean, it was always an obligation to serve that in writing, but in particular now it's good to have that confirmed because it will directly impact the landlord's right to then reset the rent to market for the next tenancy.
And separate scenario then, when a property becomes available for rent again and you're permitted to reset the market rent, is there any notification that needs to be given to the RTB beforehand, before you reset the rent?
Yeah, that's that rent setting form that Emer mentioned that and I had up on the screen. So the rent setting form is completed at the start of the tenancy, and that's given to the tenant and then also sent to the RTB, uploaded through the new service centre. Yeah.
That's a requirement on the landlord to
Yes.
complete that rent setting form.
Yeah.
It's just a couple of questions there I've picked out around the termination of tenancies. Someone has asked, will the 6-month termination for no reason by a landlord still be applicable under the new legislation for a small landlord? Apologies, you might have covered that, but can a landlord terminate a tenancy within the first 6 months?
Potentially, yes. Yeah. And that's one of those scenarios that is applicable to all landlords. But again, if people remember, at the start of a new tenancy, and it's with the proviso of any kind of lease agreement that might be in place that's fixed for a fixed period. But this idea that at the start of a new tenancy, for those first 6 months, that potential is there, yeah, for
Okay.
landlords, be they small or large landlords, yeah, in those first 6 months.
Okay. And in terms of the notice periods of termination, somebody is asking if the notice periods for termination of tenancy under the new legislation are the same for small landlords as they are for larger landlords.
Yeah, the notice of termination are the same. They weren't changed in the legislation. So the notice of termination are the same regardless of your whether you're a large or small landlord. It all just depends on whether you're allowed to end the tenancy for certain reasons.
And just when we're talking about the large, small and large landlords, somebody has asked the question if a landlord is considered large based solely on their residential holdings, or are commercial properties taken into account when you're determining the size of the landlord?
Yeah, so the size of the landlord is based on the number of tenancies that you have at the point where you're serving the notice of termination. So it really is only considered at that point when you're ending the tenancy, and it's based on how many tenancies that you have active at that point. So it only takes into account private rented tenancies.
So it doesn't take any commercial tenancies that a landlord might have aren't considered.
No, they're not considered as part of it.
Somebody has asked that, just I suppose a basic question: what term do we put on our leases from March 1st? All our current leases have 6 months, but they're really unsure as to what exactly they put on the tenancy agreements after March 1st.
I mean, that really is kind of a matter for the landlord and their agent. So there's no, in one sense, the law hasn't affected that. You know, it's always been the case that tenancy agreements can be for whatever period of time the parties agree to. 12 months is very typical. So the law, in one sense, hasn't really affected that, you know. So yeah, it's whatever the two sides agree to and are happy with. But again, just to be clear on the terms and conditions, and if there is or isn't a break clause written into that agreement, needs to be very clear.
I think one thing as well, I know it was highlighted in the presentations, but when tenancies are ending within that 6 months, while a landlord can end the tenancy, as Gary said, there is no resetting to market rent for any tenancy after it ends within the first 6 months. That is classed as a no-fault termination, so important to bear that in mind.
Yeah, it's an important point there. Yeah, thanks, Sinead. So moving on to another question: if a landlord offers an existing tenant who moved in say, for example, 2024, but they're being offered now a new lease from now onwards, does this give the right of a 6-year tenancy? Their original tenancy was prior to the new legislation.
Yeah, so any tenancy that was in existence before the 1st of March is under those rules that it doesn't have the ability to reset after the 6 years. But I suppose it's just, again, to clarify that point that Gary made about leases in the presentation, that if you have a continuing tenancy with the same tenant, even if you do a new lease with them every year, if you renew the lease, that's not a renewal of the tenancy. The tenancy is ongoing from when that tenant moved in at the start. So the tenant moved in 2024 and they're still there now on the 10th of March 2026. That's an ongoing tenancy. So renewing a lease every year doesn't reset the tenancy. It's just the ongoing tenancy. It's only that if if that tenancy ends and a new tenant moves in after the 1st of March, that's when the new rules may apply. So I suppose it's just really important for people to understand that just signing a new lease doesn't change the facts of a tenancy. And like Gary said about a fixed term lease as well, I suppose the legislation really sets out the rules in relation to tenancies and rights and responsibilities. So what's in a lease can't change that. So that applies first. So the legislation as is the baseline for every tenancy, and what may be in a fixed term tenancy or it might be in your lease agreement could be additional things in relation to, how you communicate with the tenants. Like Gary said, if it's fixed term lease, there has to be a break clause in there. There are, I suppose, really important things to remember, that just having a signed lease agreement doesn't make that much of a difference to the term of tenancy.
So in that scenario, that the question outlined that the landlord has had the tenant since 2024, the new lease, it's still the same tenancy essentially. The new lease doesn't change that. So, so just a couple of questions there around the rent register. Someone has asked, when a new tenancy is registered with the RTB, how long will it take to appear on the published register of tenancies? Will there be will it be immediate, or will there be a period of processing?
I think it is very prompt. So, I mean, assuming the registration is finalized and there's no outstanding information, it's generally within 48 hours. It can sometimes be the next day, but it just it just depends on how quickly it's processed. But it is within that 1 to 2 days. Yeah.
We're kind of running close to time. I might just ask one more question. It's if multiple different rooms are rented in a property to individuals, but common areas are shared, does this fall under one registration or multiple registrations?
Yeah, that's a very topical thing, and it's a good question. So in general, it's one tenancy. So just again to mention, house shares are very common, and I know by practice landlords and agents will sometimes deal with people on an individual basis and maybe even collect rent separately, etc. But under the law, there really can only be one tenancy at any one time in one dwelling. And by dwelling, I mean a self-contained unit. A block of apartments is different. But in your typical house share, where there's no shared common areas, by law, that is one tenancy in one dwelling and one registration.
So this person is then asking if it's does the tenants in situ before the 1st of March fall under the legislation, the tenants after the 1st of March fall under new legislation within the same property. But if it is the one tenancy, if there are tenants prior to the 1st of March, the tenancy is still essentially enforced, even if there's
it's an existing tenancy, exactly, and tenants make the occupancy type, or the occupancy may change post the 1st of March. One tenant may leave and a new tenant may join, but it's a pre-existing tenancy.
That's great. Now, unfortunately, we have hit the time, so we will have to wrap up there. I would just like to thank Gary and Emer and Sinead very much for coming in. Obviously, this is such an important piece of legislation for our licensees, so we're very happy to have been able to facilitate this webinar this morning. I think a couple of people reported that they were having some issues with audio, so just to remind everyone that this has been recorded, we will make it available on our website, and we will share a link to the video by email with everyone who registered to attend. We will also share some links to the RTB resources that you have that the guys have shared with us today. So,
Marion, if I could just say, we did thank you very much to all your attendees today for engaging with the subject matter. We appreciate your commitment to understanding the changes to rental law and to compliance. Just to say that some of the questions we saw in the chat there, I saw some questions on fair deal, landlord size, things like that. They are answered in the website FAQ, so we would encourage people to have a read of that when you send on the links after.
Yeah, we'll include a link to the FAQs then, Sinead, certainly when we're contacting all those that registered. So thanks again to everyone.